What is up, guys? Dzeeff here, and oh man, I can barely contain my excitement. A new Skull Servant card was revealed today, and I'm losing my mind. So this thing will not be released in the TCG until early 2021, but in the OCG, it's releasing on October 31st, Halloween, just in time. Luckily, because we have online dueling platforms, I will probably end up playing Skull Servants on Halloween for my sort of annual Halloween live stream, and this card is going to be really exciting to try out. In today's video, I want to talk about White Baking, this new card, kind of talk about some of the other bigger Skull Servant cards, just in case you're not aware of how the deck plays, and then also I'm going to talk about the two Shaddoll reveals from a couple days ago as well. I do obviously like Shaddolls a lot, but I didn't find the time to actually talk about those cards, but I think this is a pretty good video to do that, because in the past, actually, I have played Skull Servants and Shaddolls in the same deck. My history with Skull Servants has actually been pretty long. I've played Shaddoll Skull Servants, as I just mentioned. I played Grass Skull Servants when that grass was greener was still legal, and also I've played just like Zombie World Skull Servant variants as well. I really do like this archetype quite a lot. It's never been competitively viable, but for a long time this was my favorite casual deck by far, and then even nowadays it's still like in the top 10 favorite casual decks that I just enjoy playing for fun. Anyway, White Baking is a level 1 dark zombie effect monster with 300 attack and 200 defense, obviously all the stats of the original Skull Servant. This card's name becomes Skull Servant while in the graveyard, so one of the main parts of the Skull Servant archetype is that most of their cards are treated as Skull Servant in the graveyard so that they boost the attack of King of the Skull Servants by 1000. If a level 3 or lower zombie monster or monsters you control would be destroyed by battle or card effect, you can discard this card instead. So I wouldn't really call the Skull Servant deck a Protect the Castle deck, because you're not really trying to control the game with King of the Skull Servants. I think it's closer to like Gren Maju, where your entire deck is trying to summon this one big monster. So this card actually will be pretty valuable in the hand if your opponent has a destruction effect. The King itself kind of has protection from battle, because if your opponent destroys it in battle, you can special summon it back to the field by banishing a Skull Servant in the graveyard, but this will also give it more protection from card effects and stuff like that. I think overall that in-hand effect is pretty good. It's not like game breaking by any means, but it is pretty nice because yeah, sometimes your opponent will have a destruction effect for your king, and then you can use this and prevent it from being destroyed. I suppose you could prevent it from being destroyed by battle if you really want to. The cool part here is that this card is not restricted to just the King of Skull Servants, so if you're playing other cards in your deck that you want to protect with this ability, you can do that as well. There are obviously some pretty good level 3 or lower zombie type monsters, not only in the Skull Servant archetype, but things like Unizombie, of course. Maybe you can stop a Unizombie from getting destroyed by your opponent's card. Finally though, the big effect on this card is the third one. If this card is sent to the graveyard, you can add 2 of these monsters with different names from your deck to your hand, then discard 1 card. So you're adding Skull Servant and then a monster that specifically lists the card Skull Servant in its text, except White Baking, which is pretty much every single Skull Servant support card in the entire game. So that's very powerful, and it might not seem super good if you don't know what these Skull Servant cards do. I do want to note here that it pretty much triggers off of anything. You know, you can discard it for the Unizombie effect, you can use it for synchro material or link material, you can do whatever you want with White Baking, and as long as it's sent to the graveyard, that effect will be able to trigger. It's not a when you can effect, it's an if you can effect, so it can't miss timing. This ability is quite powerful though in combination with White Prince. White Prince was released in 2014, and it's a very important piece to every single Skull Servant deck. This card says, if this card is sent to the graveyard, you can send 1 Skull Servant and 1 the Lady in White from your hand and or deck to the graveyard. You can banish 2 Skull Servants and this card from your graveyard, special summon 1 King of the Skull Servants from your deck. This card's name becomes Skull Servant while in the graveyard, like many of the other Skull Servant support cards. So this card is very important for a couple reasons. First off, if you already have access to King of the Skull Servants, you can then load up your graveyard with 3000 attack points, because you are sending 2 Skull Servants to the graveyard while Lady in White counts as Skull Servant, and then the White Prince itself also counts as Skull Servant. But what's really cool here is that if you don't have King of the Skull Servants, you can then use this thing to sort of Lone Fire Blossom it out right from your deck. Once again, here we have another card in the archetype where it triggers when it's sent to the graveyard, just like the new White Baking. So these cards really work well in combination with each other, other because you're going to be playing a lot of cards that send cards to the graveyard, and either one of them is a good option. What's cool about the new card though is that you can actually add Skull Servant and White Prince to your hand, and then discard the White Prince and then trigger the White Prince in the graveyard. That play is pretty much going to be your main goal on turn 1. Like I said, if you already have King of the Skull Servants, White Prince just loads up your graveyard with more attack, and if you don't have the card already, this thing will get you to it. Before White Baking's announcement, we had White Princess. This is the most recently released Skull Servant support card, which is very good in the deck, a staple 3 of in my opinion, and most players' opinion for that matter. If this card is normal or special summoned, you can send one White Prince from your deck to the graveyard. During either player's turn, you can send this card from your hand or field to the graveyard. All monsters currently on the field lose attack and offense equal to their own level/rank times 300 until the end of this turn, and of course this card is treated as Skull Servant while in the graveyard. So this thing gives you extra copies of White Prince, so in combination with like Shiranui Solitaire and Unizombie and White Princess, you basically have like 12 copies of White Prince that you can access at any point. White Baking and White Prince will trigger if you just normal summon them and then use them for a Link Kribo or a Salamangreat Almirage, which is a really easy way to trigger their effects that in the past we really didn't have. While I'm pretty sure at the end of the day White Baking, like all these Skull Servant cards, will probably just be a meme, but it is a pretty good piece of support for a fan favorite archetype that I myself have played quite a bit. I look forward to trying out Skull Servants with White Baking. I think this card is very exciting, and also the artwork is hilarious. But of course, I also want to talk about 2 new Shaddoll monsters, obviously an archetype that I've played multiple times throughout my Yu-Gi-Oh career. So this is Nep Shaddoll Genius, a new Shaddoll level 4 Earth Machine flip effect monster that says, flip, you can target one Shaddoll monster you control. This turn, it is unaffected by monster effects while face up on the field, except its own. Second, if this card is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can target one effect monster on the field. It cannot activate its effects on the field for the rest of this turn. The flip effect on this card is admittedly pretty bad in my opinion. It doesn't really do that much, but the second ability is actually fairly appealing. The main use of Genius, in my mind at least, is very similar to Abclone, and often you'll want to use them in combination while you have Magical Meltdown on the field. When you do that, when you're going second against a big board and your opponent lets the Meltdown resolve, now you can use your fusion spells and your opponent can't negate them, and then when you fusion summon monsters, your opponent can't respond to their effects. What that means with this card in Abclone is that you can negate 2 of your opponent's cards without giving them a chance to respond, and for that reason I can pretty much see Genius being played as a one-of in any format where combo decks are all over the place, kind of like what's happening right now. The next Shaddoll monster was Hell Shaddoll Void, a level 9 Fire Fiend flip effect monster. Flip, you can target one face-up monster your opponent controls, send one Shaddoll monster with the same attribute from your extra deck to the graveyard, and if you do, banish that target. If this card is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can send cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard equal to the number of different original attributes on the field. So this was kind of like the reverse situation. I feel the flip effect on this card is a lot better than the previous one, but the second ability when you send to the graveyard for a card effect is actually significantly worse. Yes, you could mill like a bunch of cards to the grave and trigger a ton of Shaddoll effects, but honestly, if you are able to trigger the Hell Shaddoll Void, which means that you probably used it for a fusion summon, you usually can go through all of your Shaddoll effects in like one turn anyway. It's so easy just to summon an Abclone or summon a Construct and go through every single Shaddoll effect in one single turn. That being said, the flip effect on this card is very good, and the reason it's very good is that you can special summon this card with the Wendy face down and then use Rush in the graveyard by banishing it to flip this card face up and maybe banish a card that your opponent was trying to keep on the field. That is pretty powerful. Will it be worth playing a level 9 monster in your deck that already does have some bricking issues? I'm not entirely sure, but I will say both of these cards are a lot more valuable with Abclone in the game. Without Abclone, cards like this are pretty much completely worthless. You don't want to play Grista, you don't want to play Shaq, you don't want to have to play those cards, but Abclone makes it a lot easier to just play random one-ofs like either of these cards because they have random attributes, and that actually ends up being pretty valuable. Of course, you can always use these cards as the Shaddoll for cards like Shaddoll Construct or Shaddoll Winda, but I think Abclone was a pretty big game changer for any Shaddoll deck. Anyway though, that's all I have to say for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed this discussion. The Skull Servant cards cards, the Shaddoll cards are all very exciting. Now I'm just even more excited for the annual Halloween live stream because I'll probably play Skull Servants. I'll see you guys later though. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.